Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan. Our mission is to be a vibrant, inclusive congregation, widely known as a safe haven and a force for social justice. Our mission is to be a diverse, evolving spiritual community acting for a better world. I invite our newcomers and visitors to stay and chat after the service, in person and online. If you're here, Shirley Hobrock, give a wave there in the back. She is especially available today as our greeter to answer any questions that you might have. And if you're here in person with joys or sorrows and you would like to share later in the service, write it down on one of those slips of papers that you can find on the inner rows in a box, and we will be sharing those aloud later in the service. And if you're on Zoom, you can type it into the chat. I'm going to invite Tom Phillips and Jean Sievers up front for our land acknowledgement that we've changed up a little bit today.
So for our acknowledgement this Sunday, let us think about the Labor Day holiday. And that's tomorrow, and the many different ways that people contribute to society.
The Labor of Our Days by Jennifer Willett. What images come to mind when I say Labor Day?
Chances are you think of the holiday weekend and celebrations with your loved ones, the federal holiday, unions, and the cause of a working wage and benefits. Maybe the history of the struggle of working people to have their fair share of the profits from their work. Those are all great.
Now I want you to think of your parents and caregivers, the parent that fed you, bathed you, nurtured you, and taught the building blocks of how to be in the world. Now think of your elders. Who shops for them, goes to the doctor with them, cleans for them and cares for them when they begin to fail?
Now think of those that have physical and mental challenges of differing degrees. They come in all ages. Who assists them in the daily tasks that make day-to-day life easier and sometimes even possible at all?
Much of this is unpaid labor, yet the work of homemaking, childcare, elder care, and differently abled care isn't part of our economic system. It doesn't count on our GDP, but our society would collapse without it.
Now consider the other non-paid labor we do to mentor, to educate, to assist, to advocate, to entertain and enrich the community, the country, and the world.
Think of all that we do for our neighbors, our friends, our community, to make life better.
This is labor. A paycheck isn't the only measure of your work. Without this labor, our world would be lonelier and more desperate of a place.
Honor your labor.
If you work for money, this holiday is for you.
If you work for love, this holiday is still for you.
Our work makes the world better.
Enjoy your day.
So let us honor the work we do as Unitarian Universalists, our labor of love, with our chalice lighting and the next reading.
Now let's bring ourselves to a time of generosity. Every Sunday here at UUFM, the money that we collect goes to a local organization. The Helping Hands recipient for the month of September is True Colors. Let's welcome Katie Baker. She's going to give us a 5-minute or less rundown about True Colors.
Hi, everyone. No matter how many times I do this, it's always very intimidating to get up and talk about something that I do every single day of my life. So I am the executive director of True Colors Flint Hills. For those of you that don't know, we are a youth-run, youth-driven organization providing direct service, advocacy, and education in support of LGBTQ youth in the Manhattan and Riley County area. I have the great pleasure of basically leading this household of youth. We do operate out of a residential facility, so we really just are like a big chaotic family. Youth are allowed to attend the center during drop-in hours. So we're open every day after school until 7, and then on Fridays we stay open until 9. But when they're at the house, they have access to build community, not only with their other peers, but with staff and volunteers, where we have a very kind of like a mentor-esque relationship. They have access to food, they have access to clothing, they have access to hair dye. We also provide, yeah, I see, I like your hair. We also provide referrals to mental health services, and we can help cover those costs for youth that have some barriers there as well. And I definitely think I think everyone, we watch legislation every year and we hear some of the things that are said. And it's just a place that youth can come and be their most authentic selves. And I think what's been really beautiful too recently is we've seen a really big influx of younger, like queer adults that have been coming to the center to volunteer. And so it's really meaningful for them to give back in a capacity that they didn't have that sort of space when they were younger. But then we're also seeing kind of developing of those friendships as well. So we have started to expand some of our offerings. We're doing a community night twice a month. So our next one is going to be September 11th, and it starts at 7, and it is at the house. And that's for community members to come to the space and be able to kind of like enjoy this energy that we've been able to create. So this upcoming one, we're doing a bonfire, we're going to be doing s'mores, and we're just going to be like having community, having space to just, again, find safety. And it's not, you don't have to go to a bar, it doesn't cost any money. Like, we're just gonna have snacks and just a good energy. And then I also want to point out this Monday, so tomorrow, our wonderful volunteer Courage, who is my little basement gremlin and is always doing clothing closet things, is hosting a community clothing closet day. So the community comes to the house and they can shop. So if you know anyone that's interested, we really targeted like the K-State students since they're coming back, but people will have access to that space and they can help themselves to whatever. So thank you guys so much for choosing our organization this month. It means a lot, and I will be around. So if you guys have questions, just let me know. Thank you.
Our speaker today is Reverend Diane Miller, who served congregations, directed the Department of Ministry at the Unitarian Universalist Association. She's held numerous leadership roles over her 40 years in ministry. She's a minister emerita at the First Congregation in Belmont, Massachusetts. Diane retired to Salina, Kansas to enjoy her 2 granddaughters growing up. And before she answers the question of the day, who in the world was Ephraim Nute? We need to time travel back into the 1850s when Boston Unitarians sent a missionary to build a church in Lawrence to spread the Unitarian gospel in the Kansas Territory and to promote the abolition of slavery.
I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about bleeding Kansas. The term bleeding Kansas. Matthew Pinsker, I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about bleeding Kansas. The term bleeding Kansas was popularized in the 1850s by newspapers like Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. It referred to the violence that erupted in the Kansas Territory in the middle of the decade. That violence was an outbreak of conflict that had emerged from the passage of the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which had organized the territories in the former Louisiana Purchase under the principle of popular sovereignty, the idea that people could decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. The problem was that the doctrine of popular sovereignty didn't tell you when they could decide for themselves. So in order to decide the fate of the outcome of any referendum, forces who had an interest in the slavery issue began to rush to settle the territory. And they argued over who would govern this territory. And there was a government set up that was pro-slavery in Lecompton and an anti-slavery alternative government that was set up in Topeka. Republicans in Washington backed the anti-slavery forces. Democrats in Washington typically backed the pro-slavery forces. It was a standoff, and the standoff escalated into violence. Men like John Brown emerged. He was an abolitionist who had been living in Ohio, who followed his sons out to the territory and fought a kind of war with the pro-slavery forces. John Brown and his sons murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. There was violence that erupted around the territory of Kansas in places like Washington, D.C. A senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner was nearly caned to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate by a congressman from South Carolina in the spring of 1856. Ultimately, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of people were killed in the Kansas territory during this 2-year period of sporadic violence. And ultimately, Kansas entered the Union after a long period of political standoff on the eve of the Civil War as a free state.
Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards. These largely terroristic organizations were used to publicly humiliate, assault, and in some cases, even murder political enemies of Mao and the Communist Party.
It's good. So thank you for troubleshooting. I popped that video in there just to take us back into what was going on during that time period. So thank you for getting it to play on there. I am going to read a reflection. It's a bit of The Missing Story by Dr. Bobby Groth. I believe the American Civil War really began not in April of 1861 at Fort Sumner in South Carolina, but in 1855 in Kansas Territory. Border ruffians from Missouri invaded Kansas during the territory's first legislative election and forced the election of a pro-slavery territorial legislature, marking the beginning of a vicious, undeclared war over whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. This undeclared war lasted for years. As a child, I heard stories of our family's Unitarian and Universalist heritages that go back at least 6 generations, and the stories about great-great-grandfather Ephraim Nute. Ephraim Nute was a Unitarian missionary who founded a church in Lawrence, Kansas. Nute and many of his parishioners had chosen to settle in Kansas as a way to tip the scales in favor of the Free Staters. In spite of the dangers they knew they would face, they came. The Boston Unitarians, who received so much attention for their anti-slavery convictions, were quite insulated from the front lines, where the violent works of abolition were carried out. Ephraim Nute was their man on the ground. These brave Unitarians struggled against marauders, fought for their lives, refused to enact the fugitive slave law, hid escaping slaves, suffered from starvation and disease. Once a household name, Ephraim Nute has faded from our collective memories, so we're bringing him back. Thanks.
I appreciate the warm welcome I've had here and to see how well you as a congregation step up and share the many roles of preparing a Sunday worship service. And I'm happy to see you all here on a holiday weekend. It's really nice. Also, I appreciate the flexibility of the musicians who I had dug around and found some very old hymns to sing, but their language is very gendered, the message isn't really what we would affirm, and even though the tunes were kind of catchy, I'm very pleased that your musicians said, could we switch these out to hymns we'd like to sing, and did. So thank you all for that. So picture Kansas, deeply divided politically. Both sides believe that they have the truth and that the other side is leading the nation to its downfall. The rule of law is flouted. The Constitution is at stake. Compromise is a joke. Nobody is going to budge. People are locked in with their loyalty to political parties. Religious groups take sides, bringing Jesus and the Bible into the mix. Major issues are being left to the states to decide. Half the people don't trust the results of recent elections, believing that people voted illegally, so they don't trust the official government. There's talk of a coup, an insurrection. And times are hard. Essentials are costly. Food and building materials are through the roof, if you have a roof. Threats and violence are increasing. People are obtaining guns because they feel a need for protection. Lives are at stake. Does it sound familiar? Like our times? A little cherry-picked, but those are all factual descriptions of Kansas in 1855, a territory that will vote to decide if it will enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. Well, we know the outcome. Free state Kansas, then the Civil War. But the people of that time did not know how it would go. They were at a tipping point. What people did individually and together mattered in that tipping point. We have much in common with that era. And to reduce it to oversimplified labels and terms, the Democrats were the pro-slavery bad guys who stuffed ballot boxes with votes from Missouri residents and even ran off with ballot boxes. They terrorized people by marauding in gangs, and they were the famous border ruffians. Republicans were the abolitionists, appealing to a higher moral ground. Our religious forebears of that time were overwhelmingly abolitionist and Republican. The political labels may have flipped. And of course, women, people of color, and Native peoples could not vote in those elections. But everyone was affected, then and now. I moved here to Kansas in the summer of 2016 from the progressive blue state of Massachusetts. After the election that November, I wished that Democratic voters from places like Massachusetts and California would come in big numbers to red states like Kansas and change the outcome of future elections. How many thousands would it take to shift an election? Well, it seemed possible. That was hardly an original thought. Our Universalist and Unitarian forebears worked mightily to invite, encourage, induce, and support New Englanders with abolitionist views to move into the Kansas territory. They were leaders in the Emigrant Aid Society, and they organized settler travel groups, and even in 1855, sent a Unitarian missionary. His name was the Reverend Ephraim Nute. So let me tell you his story in brief, and also why I think it's important for us all these years later. Ephraim Nute came from New England Universalist and Unitarian forebears. Back then, those were separate but allied denominations. You've probably heard the old quip that the Universalists thought God was too good to damn them, and the Unitarians thought that they were too good to be damned. Some truth in that. Ephraim went to school at one of the public schools in Boston, the Latin schools, and then he went on to Harvard, where he was a scholarship student. Back then, Harvard was the community college across the river, established initially to train up clergy. So Nute attended Harvard Divinity School to prepare for ministry. He was duly ordained and called to serve congregations. Early on, he showed two characteristics that seemed to define his life. At the Divinity School graduation, he preached on the subject of asceticism. And this turned out to be a very useful value for ministry and especially missionary work. Second, his unyielding nature demonstrated early on in ministry when he did not, somehow he let this be known, he did not vote for a parishioner who was running for local office because that parishioner belonged to the pro-slavery party. As a righteous abolitionist, as well as an unyielding opponent of liquor, many parishioners thought that their minister was too stiff-necked for their pulpit. And as you can imagine, his ministries in several churches were relatively short. The New England Unitarians in the 1850s were not unanimously for the immediate abolition of slavery. Some made money from industries that depended on slavery, and some of that money funded churches and schools and institutions that gave Boston its reputation as a beacon of liberty in the new nation. Their professed values were not always congruent with their business decisions and how they lived. And yet there was a very strong abolitionist, activist contingent eager to stop slavery from spreading west. And those were Nute's people. In 1854, he made a visit out west, being here, and in 1855, he resigned from his congregation to become the official Unitarian missionary to the Kansas Territory. Sent and supported by the American Unitarian Association and the Emigrant Aid Society, albeit many of his letters home noted the fact that his support, his salary, and money for his mission was not coming through. It was a tough time. It was hoped that Nute would spread Unitarian values throughout Kansas, build a church, probably in Lawrence, and serve the growing population as a pastor and preacher. His mission also went beyond faith matters and included abolitionist work. He brought guns. This is somewhat unofficial in his job description, but he brought guns out to Kansas. The rifles of the time that had become much better guns were called sharps, not because they were, well, I guess maybe that's where sharpshooter comes from, but they were called sharps. They were made in Massachusetts, and he brought them in crates labeled books. And these were used to help people defend themselves and to help fugitives escaping to freedom. And the people of Lawrence needed to defend themselves from attacks and killings by the border ruffians. In the 1855 elections in Kansas, over 2/3 of the votes, and of course they were votes only from part of the population, but 2/3 of them were actually cast by residents of Missouri. The government that was then set up in Lecompton was pro-slavery and hostile to the people of Lawrence and other settlers. A law was passed, also unbelievable, making it a capital offense to speak against slavery. So even in letters, if you wrote a letter talking about your views, it could be intercepted, and in theory, you could be hung. Free speech was no longer possible. Well, Nute, his ascetic self, was kind of the ideal choice for missionary work. He accepted hardship and privation. Due to a shortage of lumber and housing. There were plenty of trees, but not mills to make lumber out of the trees. He lived at times in a tiny sod shelter, actually crowded in with a whole bunch of other people. And then later, when his wife arrived, they lived one whole winter in a tent. So his wife, Lucy, worked with him to try to establish a home. His unyielding commitment to freedom helped him take these risks, and his faith. Like many new arrivals, he found the landscape and the very promising and beautiful. He held the first Unitarian church service in Lawrence on Mount Oread, which is that how you say that? Which is where the University of Kansas was subsequently built. And for the service, it was a beautiful day and the people looked out over the valley. He was very excited and hopeful. But hardships set in with cold weather, food shortages, and the constant fear of attack. Nute appealed constantly for goods and money from his New England supporters. But he did make headway. A Lawrence Unitarian congregation was formed in February of 1856. He also gathered an ecumenical group. There were other faiths around, and he was chosen to be its leader. He was very much a community leader, both in Lawrence and in the territory as a whole. The AUA made plans to send a bell and a clock to go in the tower of the stone church being built. But the times didn't necessarily need primarily a bell and a clock. Nute had asked, "I hardly know which is most desirable, arms or a church. Both are wanted." Less than a year after he arrived, the community of Lawrence was sacked, and the border ruffians burned and stole everything that they could get their hands on and beat people up and killed some. This was not the later Quantrill's raid that happened during the Civil War, but it was one of these pre-Civil War attacks. And it's interesting to me, I didn't grow up in Kansas, so I didn't really know any of this history, and Nute's life, learning about it, put together things for me that had been separate. So right after that attack on Lawrence, the sack of Lawrence, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner in Washington, D.C., gave a famous speech called "The Crime Against Kansas." And after delivering that speech, he was beaten unconscious with a cane by Representative Brooks of South Carolina. So that event was long considered the most violent domestic attack in Congress. And it was, I always remember hearing it described as that, until January 6th and the mob attack in 2021, which was the emblem, both of them, an emblem of the breakdown of civil discourse and norms of settling political differences in a democracy. Another person who went to Kansas, as you know, was John Brown, the abolitionist. Brown was a resident of Springfield, Massachusetts during the time Nute was the Unitarian pastor there. And although John Brown was not a Unitarian, the two certainly knew each other. Brown was a businessman, and he had a large tannery, and the tannery served as a major portal for the Underground Railroad. And Nute assisted on many occasions. Ephraim Nute, in his time in Kansas, moved from being a peaceful leader to taking up arms and training with others to defend Lawrence. He struggled somewhat with the moral question about violence and faith and being a follower of Jesus. And he struggled with the fact that the basement of the Unitarian Church, which had been excavated, was turned into a fortification to protect Lawrence during battles. So while Nute was ready to take up defense and defend when attacked, John Brown chose to retaliate. 3 days after the attack on Lawrence, Brown led an attack on the community of Potawatomi, and 5 pro-slavery men were killed. The violence even reached Nute's family directly. His wife's brother and sister-in-law came to visit them on their way to settle in Leavenworth. His brother-in-law, Mr. Potter, left his wife with the Nutes and was driving a wagon from Lawrence with all of his family's worldly goods to go stake a claim, I guess. He was set upon by pro-slavery ruffians simply because he was coming from Lawrence. Mr. Potter was brutally killed and all of his family's goods stolen. When Nute went with a group to collect the body, he was captured and imprisoned for weeks in a terrible jail cell. But eventually he escaped. He had a number of close calls, almost hung twice, and somehow or other, the whole idea of jailbreaks really happened. People used to somehow break out the bars and crawl out and stick the jailer in the cell and lock them in and run away. I don't know how they did this, but they were very clever. At another time, he was driving his wagon and came to a checkpoint where the border ruffians had set up to catch people. And Nute had guns hidden under the floorboards of his wagon that he was taking to people elsewhere. But he, I guess he probably wore clerical garb, and he just boldly walked up to the border ruffians and opened his coat to show that he had no guns and he was unarmed, and they waved him past because, after all, as a clergy person, they were assumed to be outside the fight. So he got through with his guns. The era of Bleeding Kansas culminated in John Brown's ill-fated attack on the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. There is evidence from letters that Nute actually went to Virginia and tried to persuade John Brown to hold off on this plan of his to start a slave revolt. And he was unsuccessful in doing that. He worked very closely with John Brown, but very deliberately kept their public roles separate and didn't publicize the fact that they worked together on many things. John Brown was a Christian who believed he was doing God's work to fight the guardians of slavery and to create a resistance movement to overthrow it. It's a great moral dilemma to know about when to resist and how to resist oppression and violence, and whether or not to do that with peaceful means, nonviolence, or arm yourself. This fall, there's going to be a film released about Dietrich, the German pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer was part of the Confessing Church in Germany, and he began as a pacifist, but ended up resisting the Nazis. And he paid for that with his life. So watch for that film to, again, address these same issues about resistance. While many lives were lost in these struggles in eastern Kansas, the carnage of the Civil War was on another scale. Nute enlisted in the 1st Kansas Regiment as an Army chaplain. And then as the war went on, General Grant asked him to lead an Army hospital for the wounded, and he did that with 2 large hospitals. And after the war, to sort of leap forward in his life. He settled mostly in Ohio and then back in New England, where he remarried and had more children late in life. Ephraim Nute wrote his memoirs, and this was a not uncommon thing for people who'd been very involved in that era of war. And his were, must have been particularly vivid. And he had a publisher for them, but he suddenly died. And even though his wife kept his manuscript for many years, for some reason it didn't get published, it then was lost, and his story essentially forgotten. His great-great-granddaughter put together his biography largely from letters that were published in newspapers all over the country. He would write back to the Immigrant Aid Society, and newspapers would circulate it. The stone church in Lawrence survived the Civil War, but it was felled by earthquake and lightning in 1891. The congregation dedicated another church 2 years later, but they dwindled and they dissolved during World War II. In fact, around some of the same issues, that they had a minister who was a pacifist and opposed World War II, which was not a popular thing to do after Pearl Harbor and when the United States entered the war. So they dissolved during that time. And then in 1958, you may know this, you may have been to the congregation in Lawrence now, they revived with a new group, and they first started meeting in rooms at the University of Kansas, which is really somewhat choice because their stone church had been the first meeting place for the beginnings of the University of Kansas. So went full circle there. Looking back, we can see the lasting impact of a struggle that took the sacrifices of many settlers, and we can also see that they were colonists. They were pushing many indigenous people off their land and swindling, some of them actively swindling them of their rights and property, others just going through government already had claimed a lot of the land and they got their land from the government, but some directly took it from the Indians. Focused on the horror of slavery, they weren't able to see the unintentional consequences of their lives, which seemed to them to be full of good works. And of course, the Civil War and emancipation ended slavery, but they did not end racism, which continued in new forms with Jim Crow and segregation and cultural racism into our own era. It was a worthy dream, a dream of freedom, of justice, of peace, and Unitarian Universalist values on the prairie. As one of our hymns says, what they dreamed be ours to do. We are the ones here now with Unitarian and Universalist values to share in our communities. As we face the challenges of our times, it's good to remember that individuals can make a difference. I loved that video, Kid President. I'll have to watch that again. And difficult choices may require faith to sustain. And we also should know that different paths may lead to a larger goal. There's not always just one right way or one better than other ways to do it. Democracy is fragile, trust is precious, and truth can be obscured. Ad astra per aspera, through hardships to the stars. Amen.